Beethoven's Third Symphony, the Eroica, is truly revolutionary. We can miss how innovative this mighty work is, seeing as so much has happened to the symphony since, but Beethoven's Eroica was the starting point for so much of this change. The work isn't merely a refinement of the symphony, it actually redefines the form. Yes, the Eroica is something you can be hyperbolic about, so here today we're going to go into 11 fascinating and hugely important reasons why the symphony is so revolutionary. 2 big E-flat chords banged out by the whole orchestra. Sounds simple enough, but nobody had ever done that before, not like this. Symphonies would usually have higher tempo first movements, but would start with slow introductions, like Beethoven's Symphonies number 1 and 2. But number 3 opens with 2 hammer blows, taking us, like the classical epics, the Iliad or the Odyssey, right into the middle of things, in media res, right at the start. And then, as if that wasn't dramatic enough, it leaps straight into its main theme. No preparation, no politeness, these 2 chords present an aggressive assault on our ears that would have shocked contemporary audiences. And if that oral assault doesn't convince you we're in a totally new ballgame, listen to what Beethoven does a couple of minutes later. This kind of brutal emphasis was a new sound that would have stunned the ears of present-day listeners. What a start indeed. Beethoven's use of harmony, or rather lack of it, would also have made a shocking appearance for contemporary ears. Take our main theme, which we're introduced to right at the start. But this is not your usual theme. Again, it's just laying out the key of E flat we heard in those first 2 chords, but it immediately introduces dissonance into that melody with a C sharp here. And this is important. Beethoven writes this as a C sharp, not a D flat, so as to emphasise the harmonic dissonance. That harmonically unstable C sharp shows us straight away that this will be a work of combat and struggle rather than one of harmonic stability and calm. And we're talking feature, not bug here, since this is far from the most revolutionary use of dissonance in the symphony. What is happening here in the development section a few minutes later? My word, there's so much we can say about this single chord. In the woodwind alone, we're hearing an E natural and an F natural, each a semitone apart, and yet each stacked on top of one another, and an E flat in the horns, creating an incredibly tightly packed chromatic cluster. And then, cutting across that instability, comes the clarinets and low strings, playing an A natural, creating a tritone clash with the home key of E flat. You don't need to be a musicologist to hear the dissonance. This still sounds abrasive and shocking over 200 years after Beethoven committed it to a musical manuscript. And that's not all. Beethoven doesn't just slip in a dissonance to tickle our fancy before resolving it. No, he repeats it, forte, stabbing our ears 5 times before eventually letting the dissonance resolve. This is telling us that this music will be a struggle, and that struggle will not be quick nor easy. Running at 50 minutes odd, the Eroica is almost double the length of a normal Mozart symphony, whilst just the opening movement runs the length of a normal Haydn symphony. And it's not just the longest symphony widely performed up to that time, it's the longest by some distance. But that's just length in time, without considering the musical diversity and scale of this humongous piece. Beethoven does things that really grow the size of this piece from a structural aspect. like for example, bringing in totally new themes at totally unexpected moments. So, for example, right in the development section of the first movement, directly after our shriek chord resolution, we hear this. It's a totally new theme and an important one, which will reappear and be used at the end of the movement, which in musical terms is stunning. Beethoven introducing an important new theme whilst he's supposed to be developing the material he's already presented. Again, this may not appear strange today, but this was an entirely new way to make music. Or how about checking how Beethoven handles the end of this movement, in other words, the coda, the moment that's supposed to help bring our music to a close. The coda gets similar treatment from Beethoven, meaning what is happening at the end of the first movement, where our supposed coda seems less like an ending than something that's continuing to develop. And yes indeed, during this final coda, we are reintroduced to that new theme from the development section. In structural terms, this is colossal. After Mahler, Bruckner and the like, it's easy to lose sight of this size and scale, but contemporaries felt it obviously, with the famous anecdote of an audience member shouting from the gallery at the 1805 premiere, "I'll give another kreutzer if the thing will only stop." The Eroica is directly tied to the political convulsions of European politics to an extent unheard of at the time and quite possibly still to this day. Most of this boils down to the largest political figure of Beethoven's era, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon had taken French revolutionary forces that had toppled the Ancien Regime in 1789 and turned them into an extremely efficient war machine that hurtled across Europe, even reaching Egypt and the surrounding seas. At first, Beethoven, himself sympathetic to the revolutionary or at least Enlightenment causes of the revolution, at first he was behind Napoleon and indeed had written this symphony about the French general, even titling the work the Napoleon Symphony on its front page. But then, with the ink barely dry on the page, Napoleon goes and declares himself Emperor of France. He literally crowns himself at Notre Dame. Beethoven, a Republican, was appalled, and in a fit of rage tore Napoleon's name from the title page. And this isn't some classical myth. You can literally see the evidence of Beethoven's anger with the scratchings on the original manuscript. And he renamed the symphony, no longer the Napoleon, but now the Eroica, the heroic symphony. Napoleon, the actual figure, had become a symbolic, heroic representation. Well, you can take Napoleon the man out of the symphony, but the politics still remain. A symphony representing the life and death of a figure in history fighting for the universal values of liberty, equality and brotherhood. No other symphony had ever had such a connection to the most crucial and important politics of its time, and indeed since. This in itself was an entire revolution of its own. Yes, there's a story inside the Eroica. Even after removing Napoleon's name from the front page, Beethoven left on the 1806 Italian score the words "composed to celebrate the memory of a great man," which gives us a narrative in 4 movements. The heroic figure struggling but managing to overcome forces in movement 1, the death of our hero, the funeral of movement 2, a renewal of life and vitality with the 3rd movement, and finally, in the 4th movement, a story of transformation and triumph, the legacy of our hero, spreading a message, presumably the victory of enlightenment and freedom. But even this doesn't give us the truly revolutionary nature of this story. You see it not just in the story itself, but the way it's told. Symphonies previously may have had programmatic elements in them, sections where the music shows us something in the real world, a storm or birds or even abstract things like courage or fear. But Beethoven's Eroica does something very different with its stories. It doesn't show us the thing, it lives it. The music doesn't present us with ideas and concepts, but actually works through them organically in the music. That is, the music isn't just showing it, it's transforming. And it does so across all its movements, unifying them within a single narrative. Again, this was new and revolutionary in symphonic writing. All of which means Beethoven doesn't just show us a struggle, for example. We experience that struggle, we go through it till we experience the victory after the struggle. Beethoven isn't just showing us something like an idea of triumph, but rather we experience in the music how triumph is achieved, and this is revolutionary indeed. In doing so, the Eroica effectively invents what we now call the heroic style. Music built not on balance and decoration, but on struggle sustained over time and the hard-won transformation that comes from it. This is how the objective classical music of Mozart and Haydn will become the subjective romantic music of Brahms, Bruckner and Mahler. It's a true revolution, not just in music, but in art. We aren't just shown something, we live it. And this will lead to perhaps the most important revolution of all, which will make up my final section. But for now, let's pay attention to the way Beethoven handles particular symphonic movements. The Eroica contains the standard 4 movements of a symphony, but to achieve his narrative, Beethoven needed to change what some of those movements did. And the most striking example of that comes with the second movement. Usually this is a place of peace and rest in the classical symphony, but in Beethoven's hands, the slow movement becomes an actual funeral. Now, funeral marches existed in music at Beethoven's time, in operas or piano works for example, but never in a symphony. This was a structurally bold move indeed, and it halts the narrative in its tracks. It's kind of like the equivalent of killing our hero in the first act of a film. Moreover, this slow movement is large, and that forces us to take the symphony really differently to how previous symphonies worked, where the slow movement merely operated as a resting point in the music. There's so many layers to Beethoven's innovation here that even putting it in words hardly justifies how revolutionary Beethoven's innovations are. Perhaps not as large an innovation as those first 2 movements, but this is one of my favourite changes, as Beethoven transforms the usual minuet trio of the 3rd movement into a much more powerful scherzo, and that's an innovation that really unleashes the musical ability of the 3rd movement. Minuet trios have always, for me at least, been the most boring places in a classical symphony, the part that's most trite and musically uninspiring. It's like a little light relief after the slow movement and before the finale. Musically, for me, a bit of a snooze fest. But that all changes here as the relaxing minuet trio becomes a far more active revival, which was so good for the form of the symphony. Think of Beethoven's other scherzos, the 5th, or the 2nd movement of the 9th. These movements are dynamic powerhouses that re-energise the music rather than just offering a moment of rest. This was something necessary if the symphony was to sustain long times, longer of an hour or more. Beethoven's scherzos became standard in the form, with most other composers that followed using it in the same way, and the minuet trio largely being consigned to the historical trash can. It's a change I thoroughly commend. Sorry, but the relative disappearance of the minuet trio is something I'll always be grateful for. Again, a whole new way to do a finale. Beethoven doesn't go to the standard rondo or sonata form for this finale, but instead uses a theme with variations. And not only that, he does it in a totally unique way. First of all, the flurried introduction. Next, an incredibly threadbare, stripped back theme. And then, even more innovatively, Beethoven begins weaving different melodies and motifs into the music. These variations aren't just separate blocks of sound joined together, but an organically growing edifice that builds as the music intensifies. And then there's the use of fugal writing in different sections, adding to the complexity and beauty of this growing body of sound. And transforming it not just into separate variations, but into a single and unified whole movement. I have to confess, it was only after years of acquaintance with the Eroica that I even realised this movement was in theme and variation form at all, which speaks volumes for how well Beethoven has integrated the form into the movement, and indeed this entire movement into the whole work. Beethoven manages to use elements of rhythmic fracture throughout the work, and this is a big subject since there are so many sforzandos on weak beats and displaced accents and ragged rhythms throughout the whole piece, so many that it actually becomes a feature of the entire work. Think of this section in the first movement. We started off at the start of the section hitting our sudden loudnesses on the second offbeat. Remember, we're 3 beats to a bar here. But then we switch to a beat every second beat, a new meter, and the effect is to displace the rhythm in a way that seems to unhinge us from the music and take us into new ground. This is not how meter worked in a classical symphony. Sections like this would have amazed, or at least confused, contemporary listeners. Or how about this obvious example of the main theme's introduction in the final movement? Offbeats everywhere. Beethoven even manages to find humour with the technique, as with this famous example in the third movement, where the rhythm is dotted each of the first 3 times we hear it. But on the final playthrough, the rhythms are all played straight. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what's known as a Beethoven joke. Permission to smile granted. Beethoven's use of the entire orchestra changed forever the way instruments were used in the symphony. Previously, instruments were used to add decoration to an overall sound, but Beethoven gave voice to the instruments as individual voices inside an overall narrative. Just look at one of my favourite sections in the first movement, where Beethoven indicates single instruments play solo in the score, so as to emphasise the instrument's individual voice. The most celebrated example of this is his addition of an extra horn to the brass section. Usually instruments like the horns were paired in 2s, just to give extra volume to those parts, but Beethoven added an extra third horn and scored for those horns separately, as he famously here at this point in the third movement. Again, this would become standard fare in the orchestra, utilising different instruments to make individual contrasting voices within the overall sound of the orchestra, but Beethoven is the one that rings the changes, most famously in this part of the first movement, where the horns seem to enter prematurely. It may not sound so strange today, but this was unusual for its time, really unusual. So unusual that players during rehearsals assumed the early horn entry was a mistake, and Beethoven had to explicitly tell the orchestra that this was entirely deliberate, and to play the parts as he had written them. This may be the most nebulous of the refinements in this great work, but might actually be the most revolutionary. The Eroica Symphony sets out an entirely different way with which the public was supposed to engage with a work of music. For the music of Haydn and Mozart, what was important was that it entertained the audience, which meant the aesthetics were principally about pleasure and prettiness. The Eroica changed all of that. Now a work of art was intellectual. Now a work of art could challenge you rather than just make you happy, which changes the entire purpose of the art form. This was massive. This meant the composer had an entirely different framework for producing his art. Now his own psychology, intellect or politics, now the personality of the composer himself becomes crucial in the production of the music, and that is what paves the way for Schubert, Wagner, Mahler, Shostakovich, pretty much every composer that comes afterwards. This changes the entire function of art itself. The Eroica, it can rightfully be said, truly changed everything. Please like and subscribe.